everybody excessively because he was still at the phase where he was happy to be there. So that, to me, does not make sense, but it's a good story that Vince Russo could make up if indeed he wanted to make up a story about, a reason for this to make himself look like a babyface when Bradshaw started getting heat for being a bully to people. Well, I wanted to take him down myself. He just wants to, he's a fucking wagon hopper. He wants to hop on the fucking wagon, but he drags his feet.
What do you remember about how it was first pitched to Vince or how you first heard about it?
Well, see, that's the problem is I was off the creative team by that point, so I don't know how it was first pitched. But when I first heard about it, the impression that all of us had initially, and I'll go into more of this in a second, but you got to remember a lot of the boys, when you hear Bart Gunn talk or you hear any of the boys talk, most of the guys, all the guys in the tournament at that time had never been in the office, had never been part of a booking team or booking committee or bookers themselves. And they see things related to their own personal position, which is natural. But whereas a lot of guys saw that there was some deep-seated meaning to this at start, or that somehow there was punishment afterwards that was designed for this or whatever, I guarantee you, and that's nothing. Russo already admitted in the show, he would sit and watch, he and fucking Ferrara would watch Jerry Springer all day and write the wrestling program. I guarantee you that one of the Vinces, probably Russo, saw some television piece somehow on mixed martial arts, ultimate fighting, or even a tough man contest. And because you know how people get a germ of an idea and then somebody else says something and you've seen something on TV and whatever the fuck. And that's the way songs are written and fucking books are written and etc. I had tried to get them to do Severn and Shamrock 3 on pay-per-view and had sent copious notes on what you could do with Dan Severn, you couldn't do with Dan Severn, etc. But that had never manifested itself. But then suddenly we hear, well, we're going to have a brawl for all. And Bruce, I remember Bruce explaining it to me because he's always the explainer, as we said on the drive-through this last week. He'll explain it exactly like Vince wants it explained. I said, you got to be out of your fucking mind. What do they do? Oh, no, it could be great, Corny. Vince Russo had the barest idea that there was something going on called Ultimate Fighting. I don't know whether they were calling it mixed martial arts yet. This was still before Dana White had bought the company, when they'd been kicked off pay-per-view, but they had done those massive pay-per-view buys. And there was an underground buzz about it. If he was keeping up with ECW, then he probably knew something about this. But because Russo didn't know anything about the rules of pro wrestling to begin with, he definitely didn't know anything about mixed martial arts fighting or what the UFC was legitimately doing. And I'm sure when he pitched it to Vince McMahon, Vince always liked, oh, yeah, they'll really be laying the leather in there, pal, because he was a boxing guy. If he's thinking of real fighting, he's thinking of boxing because he's been a pay-per-view promoter. And at the time, that's what ruled pay-per-view was boxing. And he probably the tough man contest. That probably appealed to Vince's macho fucking whatever he's got going on where, yeah, we'll put gloves on them. They have the big gloves on because they use the big gloves. So nobody will get hurt, but boy, they'll fucking swing and blah, blah, blah. Basically, you had two Vinces together that neither one of them knew anything about the burgeoning mixed martial arts scene, Ultimate Fighting Championship, what it was really about, doing some kind of weird offshoot with all of the supposed tough guys that they had on the roster. And all those guys were tough in their normal elements. But besides the fact that neither one of them, I mean, Shane, as you'll recall, before Dana White bought the UFC, Shane wanted Vince to buy it and got mad when he didn't buy it, from what I heard. And that may have led to Shane leaving and going, didn't he invest in a Oriental mixed martial arts company at some point in time or whatever?
I'm not sure, but I used to work with Bob Meyerowitz, and he's the founder and creator of the UFC, founder and first owner of UFC with SEG, Semaphore Entertainment Group. And he told me a story once that he was in New York at a restaurant, And this was after Shane had wanted to buy it. And that he sees Vince, and he knows Vince. I mean, they're both pay-per-view big shots.
Yeah.
And he sees Vince with some guy, and he goes, "Hey, Vince, how are you?" And Vince goes, "Bob, I want you to meet my son-in-law, Triple H." And Bob thought he was joking. He's like, "There's no way Vince would marry his daughter off to some wrestler."
Oh, my God.
And he goes, "I remember looking at him and thinking, he's joking. And then I realized he wasn't joking."
Well, anyway, so they've got the barest idea of how something like this will work. And they're going to put these guys in it. And I immediately raised all the red flags, which nobody listened to anyway. What the fuck? Number one, if it's supposedly a shoot, then that makes everything else we're doing a fucking work. It exposes the wrestling business. Number two, once I heard the fucking rules, you've got all American wrestlers who are going to have to compete with fucking boxing gloves on. You've got guys that have fought in tough man contests, but fucking takedowns are legal. There've never been rules, and this is something I stressed with the Dark Side guys, but it was too inside baseball. They cut it out. Just the whole idea that the rules were neither fish nor fowl. There had never been competitive fights staged under these rules. The rules weren't even finalized until they were still tinkering with them 2 or 3 weeks in. It would show everybody at their worst because the wrestlers can obviously take the boxers if they can take them to, but you couldn't submit anybody because there was no submissions and you're wearing boxing gloves. So you take them down, you have to let them back up. It benefit the rules. And then I said, you're putting a lot of money on the line for these guys. So they're going to really fight and then you're going to have ill will. And I said, they're not trained for competition. So even if they're in wrestling shape, they may not be in competition shape. Well, that proved to be a fucking prophetic statement when everybody got hurt. And I hated the thing from the fucking start. But another rumor or, long-standing fucking belief has come about that JR said, okay, this will be Doc's. That JR was somehow behind it because he either wanted Dr. Death to win it or was whatever the fucker was trying to get him to win it. JR heard the idea, and instead of me, because we're two different personalities, I just mentioned everything that was fucking wrong with it, and it was stupid because Vince Russo was behind it, and it made no sense. JR, being more level-headed than I am, said, all right, if we're going to do this fucking thing, he didn't like it any better than I did, but how can it work? How can it serve us somehow? How can we do some good with it? Dr. Death had just been signed. And I don't care if any of the fans think, oh, well, why the fuck would they think that Dr. Death was going to win it just automatically unless the fix was in? No. If you were in the wrestling business at that period of time and you'd been in the business for any length of time and somebody said Dr. Death Steve Williams is going to be in a shoot fight, there was no doubt who was going to fucking win it. It was going to be Dr. Death. And all things being equal without the screwy rules and just the stupidity, yes, Doc would have won it. But the idea that JR was then trying to make it happen that way was ridiculous because the whole tournament was fucked up. The bracketing was never consistent. They didn't know what the fuck they were doing. From the start, Severn won his opening round match because all he did was just take Godfather down over and over because Godfather had no defense for a UFC Hall of Famer taking him down. But once he took him down, he couldn't fucking do anything with him because you had to let him back up, and he's wearing gloves. And I heard at the time, and I never had any reason to doubt it, Dan later on has said that he was told to fucking pull out, but Dan Severn was a UFC Hall of Famer and was the most decorated amateur and professional athlete in this fucking competition, decorated in amateur wrestling, AAU, and Olympic-style wrestling, everything, and had that UFC record. His first fight in, I remember him telling me after his first fight that any fucking putz could win this thing because the way the scoring was, the point system was, the fucking rules of the whole thing. And he pulled out to salvage his reputation. And then, he said that they told him to pull out. I can't say whether they did or not, but it was a good decision.
Wasn't Ken Shamrock asked to be in it and he refused because he actually wanted to train? Because he actually knew that you need to train to do something like this. You can't just go into it willy-nilly.
Well, I think that was his excuse because he was like, wait a minute, once again, I'm a fucking real professional with a real goddamn reputation. And yes, people, if I'm doing worked pro wrestling, that's one thing. But if I'm losing a fight to a fucking guy who's never had a professional fight before for real because of this stupid fucked up rule system they've got, that could have done damage to him. And so either way, he didn't want to do it because it was stupid. So then poor Bart feels like that he was punished because Doc didn't win it. And everybody knows the story. They didn't go into it specifically there if you didn't already kind of know it to begin with. But Doc came out. Nobody was going to knock Doc out. You know, Bart hit like a fucking brick, right? But if Doc was mobile and hostile and could take people down or do whatever the fuck, but Doc comes out and fucking tears his goddamn hamstring. That goofy bump through the ropes did, I can't remember whether that was it or whether he tore it trying to fucking lean into it afterwards. But anyway, he's a one-legged man in an ass-kicking contest, and he just stood right in front of that fucking shot. And Dr. Death, after four times All-American in wrestling, a pro for 20 fucking years, there are 15 years at that point, a fucking 4-time All-American football player, he'd never fought with gloves on in his life. So it was just all goofy. And anyway, Bart believes that he was punished. But the thing was, he wasn't punished because the only plan to push anybody coming out of this thing, besides Vince Russo saying, well, whoever wins will be a big star, was, okay, this could get Doc ready to run with Steve Austin, because that's obviously why Dr. Death Steve Williams was there. To have a run with Steve Austin, and Steve Austin would have loved to fucking work with Dr. Death, and Dr. Death could have been a heel that, as hot as Austin was at that time, that the people believed could fucking break Austin into pieces, and you would have had some pay-per-view matchups there, and they were two straight-ahead guys that would have probably done great working with each other. But Bart Gunn had been presented for 5 years as a middle card or underneath guy, first as a member of the team, and even the Smoking Guns were more over than Bart Gunn was as a single at that time, not taking anything away from his talent, but because the way he had been presented. He wasn't just going to suddenly come in, do this tournament, win matches that were getting booed out of the building because it wasn't wrestling and the fans didn't want to see it, knock these guys out, and it's still the same Bart Gunn. And he's knocked out other guys that were in the middle of the card. Whether it was a shoot or a work, didn't make any fucking difference. He was still beating other guys that were in the middle of the card, or they wouldn't have been in that tournament to begin with. The only guy that was headed to the top was Dr. Death, and he was in it because he'd never backed down from a fight. He'd never lost a fucking fight, and he figured, okay, this will get me ready for a title shot. The winner was not automatically going to work with Steve Austin. If Dr. Death won the thing, he was going to work with Steve Austin. But you think if Godfather won, he was going to work with Steve Austin? No. So whatever they told Bart, and I can believe Bruce told him anything, it wasn't going to happen that way. They had no plan for how to push Bart Gunn because they didn't think Bart Gunn was going to win, but there wasn't really any way to push Bart Gunn otherwise than to send him away for 6 months to a year and have him come back with a different fucking look, because they'd been using Bart Gunn. There was nothing different about him, except he knocked out a bunch of other guys in the middle of the card, and he knocked out Dr. Death, who had never been in the WWE before and was just in the process of starting to get over. And the injury fucking finished that off. So there was no conspiracy to penalize Bart. It was just, what are you going to do with him afterwards? He did what was best for him. He went to Japan with a new name and a whole new look and a new et cetera, and he got over and did, fairly well in Japan for, several years after that. But there was no punishment or whatever the fuck for doing that. That's the way that it worked out. And you didn't watch the After Dark show with Chris Githard, the fucking host who looks like Carl Alfalfa Switzer and Squiggy had a fucking baby. But they did